Thank you. Yeah, my name's Ross Spencer. I'm a software developer. I'm in my day job at Artifactual Systems. Uh, Outside of my day job, I'm also a software developer. So there's a lot of code in my life. My pronouns are he, him, his. Um, and am I Star Trek, Star Wars, or the stars? Well, I said to my partner that I'm probably happiest on the wing. So I'm such a traveler, but which would make it really torturous for me to sort of go to look at the stars when I know that I can't quite get out there yet. So I'm very much a Star Trek person. And I think, I don't know, I just love the writing in that show. And there's one episode where Picard, I don't know if he's breaking script or character or if this was written, but he they send Geordi on an away mission to a Klingon ship, and they stop the show almost for Picard to explore how he views the world, and how he's looking out of this visor, and he's like, I can't believe this is how you see. And it was really wonderful. I mean, it's such a great meditation on so many things. I thought that was going to be a good segue into my introduction, but actually, what I wanted to touch upon was when Jordan and I first started to talk about this. I suggested it might be a bit of an existential meditation, but I'm not sure if it really lives up to that. What I've got down on page here. But what I hope I get right, given the group and how rich discussions tend to be, is that I will ask a lot of questions that I hope will stimulate some good discussion. I think the running time will be under 20 minutes, and so that would be great. So no pressure for asking questions at the end, but we will need questions. So my GitHub profile shows that I've been working in open source since 2012, but actually outside of GitHub, I was publishing to a website called planetsourcecode.com since about 98, 99, which makes me feel incredibly old right now. Applications like the Yoda lottery number generator and the original pigeon racing game simulator. It was called Pitch Racer. My publishing didn't really die down during that, the decade in between when I, got back onto GitHub. But GitHub really did make things quote unquote take off for a number of us. I think at least provided better tools to socialize our work. It was at the National Archives UK that my work really became open by default. I was open by default because I couldn't get the support I needed at work, and recognized open source might be a way around that. I created two separate projects there around file format identification and democratizing that work. There was a related in-house tool which that work was based upon, which was published in the open and to the public and departments. Increasingly, both tools I created were open source. Interestingly, both tools I created were open source, but more important than their being open source was just their publication as a service that could be used. One tool, the signature development utility, enables users to write file format identification signatures compatible with the Jord format identification tool, which scans file formats for byte sequences that match file format magic numbers. Being able to publish that onto a website was key to opening up that process for other colleagues in the field, where the process we used internally were very much based around a closed database with restricted access. It's interesting for me to reflect upon on taking the code out of open source for a moment and think about the relationship with publishing in general. We really didn't get any investment in code from external contributors, but folks did get use from the tool. Ideally, what I would have loved to have happened by having the code in the open would be for others to take it and extend the user interface, making it more user-friendly and able to aggregate lots of these file format signatures into one, where it was strictly limited to one, primarily because of my lack of user interface skills. But the code is all there. So folks were able to do that if they wanted. I have a little bit more experience now, and so I think that there might be a little bit more news on that work nearly a decade later this month. Still, without a great deal of participation in that effort, more a lone developer, I do ask questions, both from the time and with a little bit of hindsight. Should I have promoted it more? What are the implications of that? I really only had my personal blog to talk about it at the time. Was it the right language to write the code in? PHP with clunky vanilla JavaScript and some pretty shaky HTML. If it was the right language for the need, would things like the lack of testing or quality of code put people off? I think it might. Another nice open source project that came about in New Zealand, again, related to content analysis, came about in New Zealand, and it was again related to content analysis. Though whether we would have written it or found ourselves contributing to another project was probably about 50-50. Contributing to another project would have been really nice. I started with some due diligence, looking at a tool called C3PO. The C3PO came from clever, crafty content profiling. The tool was developed by Peter Petrov and Arthur Kolmak-Hamatov at the Technical University of Austria in Vienna. I should just know that I think that's already 2 Star Wars references in this talk. It would take the analysis of another tool called FITS and provide collection level analysis, statistics and charts. Actually, do you know what? I can actually send you a link as we talk about that. I'll put that in the chat. For a developer without the ability to create compelling visuals, something Peter knows at the moment, it was a nice looking choice for us. With some decent effort over the weekend and then back at work on the first Monday back after deciding to try to use the tool, I wasn't able to get the application up and running. I didn't understand the dependencies well enough, and it used Java, which I already found quite difficult to work with. And it also used something called the Play framework for publishing web apps, which I had no idea about. Any particular dependencies in general were going to be a tough sell to the department, which had pretty rigid rules around that because of the other government departments that were on the same network. So we started to look at creating our own tool. It took the output of format identification tools and splits them out into more atomic data components that help with appraisal and submission to the digital preservation system. I'm not very good at naming. For a while, it lived as the Droid Siegfried SQLite analysis engine, but a colleague at Archives New Zealand has since suggested to demystify. So let's go with that. The features of the tool included naive coding style at the time, and it was core Python. That is, it only used only things that were available in the standard Python language. The language allows you to import third-party libraries through a tool called pip. Pip will save those libraries into the correct locations on their operating system or the virtual environments, and then they can be used. But again, writing around dependencies in the department was going to be tough. At the time, pip couldn't even be used over the network. So there would need to be some managing upwards across teams and outside of Archives itself if we were to try that. I work a little bit more freely now, but I thought it taught me a lot. And having observed the situation in 2 organizations, I try not to assume what liberties folks have at their disposal in their organizations to install and use others' software. Everyone is dealing with something different. If you can get hold of a programming language and use it, I still believe there's a lot that can be achieved. But I know for some, even that will be tough. I should note as well, I'm not advocating that everyone should code here. There is a lot that you can contribute to open source without code. Another feature of the tool was that as we started to demonstrate the value of it, we were able to socialize it a little more with the organization. And we sought the input of the archivists and potential users to include entry-level digital preservation, tooltips, and in-application documentation. Because it was open source, that knowledge is encoded now and available just by downloading the tool from GitHub, which I think particularly reinforces mine and I hope others' decisions to create open source projects. Some questions I have about that tool's experiences are, were the C3PO repository more active? Would it have made a difference to how we first attempted to engage with it? Daily, I think contributing to it would have been perfect for us at the time. I think it can enhance reputation, and it's really important not to reinvent the wheel and to support projects as we ourselves hope that we can be supported in the future too. How many others in the call have looked at something but found its entry point too difficult? Hands up from Jordan. And so chose, well, and also then chosen to write something for yourselves. Good to see. Or just find a better alternative, maybe even paid for something. Do many others have restrictions on what they can install at work? Not just to code, but any tools they might want to use. Creating this tool initially was easy to do alone, but eventually it took the team at Archives New Zealand to contribute their feedback into it and create something more useful. Making it public was an important goal achieved. We were sharing knowledge. Ideally, though, putting it into the commons, we were seeking input from others, looking for bugs and fixing them. And there was a hope for things like translation too, which would have been cool. I mentioned in response to Devon's forum message this week that there's a temptation for me to say there's a great intersection between what we need in digital preservation and the benefits of open source. But for all of the analysis tools, arrangement, or packaging tools we create, it is in fact just a reaction to the closed sourceness of what we work with around the outside of digital preservation workflows? If you look at some of the other work being done, we were chaining things like the output of our analysis tool to other mechanisms that interface with much bigger systems. Open source tool development for me does start to look like a reaction. Tools for parsing metadata from enterprise record management systems, which largely seem to be closed source, and the extractive data that always, and those systems where the data extract mechanisms aren't always intuitive. The records are yours, of course, one hopes. Tools for creating submission information packages for digital preservation systems as well, which is work I do see lots of folks repeating depending on your system. When talking about records, we talk about create to maintain. It would be great to see more open source options when we create and store records, rather than having to write more code in response when it comes to disposal and archiving. I haven't really a point there actually, but it's just something I like to meditate on. I should touch upon my current role because I am a software developer at a company that maintains open source software. How do things like change when working in open source professionally? Well, first, I think for all of us doing this, if you're in a software house or somewhere else, we're already doing it professionally. There isn't a difference. I appreciate there might be a great gaps in the resources available to you or the amount of buy-in you can get from management. But yeah, working for a company that's known for software, perhaps more specifically services around software, doesn't change too much. I don't feel as I wrote this today anyway. One of the things that folks can really benefit from is peer review of code. I had missed that from my first role many moons ago. Or was it a Death Star? But it has been good to shape my, sorry everyone. But it has been good to shape my code style up recently. Being able to work with code daily now and not in my spare time outside of work to sell it up to an organization really makes a difference to my well-being. And also it does prepare you a little bit more to take on more complex projects and make your work feel more professional and make it something that you feel like you might be better able to maintain into the future. Some of the challenges are familiar. Even a well-known application doesn't necessarily have a massive number of public submissions. In a more well-known application as well, there's an understanding too that submissions aren't necessarily a blessing to the project. As it relies on certain ways, as it is relied upon in certain ways by users, it is an important skill for our product owner to help maintain the tool's consistency. And for developers, it's a skill in shaping external contributions into something compatible to the styles and encoded knowledge of the system proper. in Jordan's email before the talk, that's the ton of patience and the ton of community building skills that you need to develop. We spoke about resources. Well, even having two of you, I feel looking at the same thing seems to be able to make a difference in quality. In splitting responsibilities like coding, while another writes documentation or tests or deployment scripts. For an example, of course, where I work, we probably have a factor of 10 more that work on the product lifecycle. Not insignificant, but not quite the Linux kernel project either. And if you only need two, at the very least, for peer review, there are ways I can see that we can do this through distribution systems like GitHub and GitLab that exist to us, that are available to us. I've spoken about two of my projects, but the backlog of projects is many. I've selected these two because they're probably the ones that I have invested the most in, and also they speak most about my intentions and hopes for working open source in digital preservation and information records management. There is an emphasis on maintaining long-term record here, looking after information and opening up to others. Making it open is always in the hope that it will be useful to at least one other person or group of people. And I'm a fan of the null hypothesis. Knowing something is out there and has been tried, even if it didn't work or showed something other than you anticipated, is important too. You can save others time by putting your most esoteric or drafty work out there. There's a lot of other projects available in my GitHub repos and subrepos. None of them really got the open source magic sprinkles though. It would be nice to figure out the magic for one tool, but I do suspect it would be asking to bite off more than I could chew. So I had, have further questions sort of like stem from all of that experience. Participating in a study over Christmas from the University of San Diego, one question that popped into my mind was what it means for a project to ostensibly go viral, to be what some might judge successful. They say to make a website successful, you need an Instagram, Facebook, and a Twitter, as well as your website. But for open source projects, the more you would like to share it, do you also need to prepare to write the code and to follow up with code for lib-like journals? Or be out there promoting your work in person at conferences? How do you do that without backing? How do you do that if you're working in your spare time? Does it differ culturally? Larger countries with greater population might help promote your work, or do different locations have greater openness to technology? Would a Reddit post be enough? There are good threads for specific programming languages, but I haven't done that, which speaks to another point. It's scary, and there are still plenty of issues around open source and being out there on the web. It's almost easier not to promote work at all. I feel like publishing, from my experience anyway, might be safe. I think less people are looking than you might think, and there are fewer people with the skills to look at it too deeply. But actively promoting something to seek contribution does feel like a much greater leap. And going back to the top a little, we had one project that was difficult to resurrect, though I think there's people might have had better luck since. But it does make me think using existing code within a few years of its creation is such a low bar. Others in the room have more experience here, but how do we really preserve it for later to use later on? And related, I know that there are restrictions at previous organizations of what we could and couldn't do. The resolution was to work in core language libraries only. I personally think there's a resilience that might bring and a potential to preserve. All you need the code and its runtime. There are no dependencies, but there's some disciplines of that work. There is a trade-off to the enjoyment you might get from developing and the ease of creating something. Would it be worth it? Would it really be worth it? After all, what is the lifespan of what you're creating? And related further, it's a question I really like to think about. Is there a perfect language? Is it Python? Is it something that exists? Is it something new that doesn't exist yet? Would some standardization of languages and practices help specifically co-sustainability and socialization and sharing of knowledge? What would it need? Ease of installation, ease of translation, ease of writing tests, ease of writing documentation. These are all big considerations when choosing anything at all. In short, is there a framework that the heritage sector could adopt to share vast knowledge and skills and amplify capability? That's not really a conclusion to this talk today, but it does happen to bring me to the end. Really, the last thing to put out there is that I would love to know what resonates in this very brief reflection here with others, and what open source means to them.
Thank you so much, Ross. I'm halfway through responding to a comment of Kelsey's in the chat, but I'm really happy to hear not just some of my, so as someone who's a total noob in the open source community world, I work with, I liaise with developers in an open source shop, but I actually remember being asked in my job interview for this position, how do you decide whether or not to learn a tool on your own or let the people with the expertise do that work? And in my first year and a bit in the role, I'm like, okay, I'm going to understand the basics of Git workflows and how to understand how our deployment fits into this broader community of software development, which of course is informed by a political economy of its own. But really, the most humbling part of this whole process for me was learning how to communicate with developers as someone who's been outside of that for so long.
Jordan, I can't even communicate with developers. I get so wrapped up in my head that it all comes out the wrong way.
Yeah, Kelsey, I barely even know what a pull request is. I see Kelsey dropping in with what's a PR in the chat. Jessica asks, would you like to get on the mic and speak up, Jessica? Or I can just read.
I'm on. Yeah, my question is, I've been around for a long time, and my first open source software was the X Windows system, which I worked on the first distributed version of in 1984. And so I've been used to everything I write. Working for the Smithsonian, everything I write is effectively open. The source is always available, and I've been distributing it for a long time, 30 years, and 25 on the web. I've had a website for a long time. And so my problem is I've been doing this for longer than most of the sites. My site has still been accessible continuously over that full time with all the software on it. So I have a different time frame than most people currently writing stuff, I think. And so I'm curious. So I think about the past and into the future, although my future is limited. But I've been working over in astronomy. I literally work on long time scales, sort of the intermediate ones between the length of the universe and an orbit of a close giant planet, exoplanet. So I'm just curious what time frame people expect software to last. My feeling is now, because people write in newer and newer languages, that first, old stuff gets lost, and second, new stuff has an indefinite future lifetime. And so I just wonder what people think about lifetimes. Also, for those who work purely with data, what do you think about for your lifetime of data and data access? Digital data is tricky. And I'll let people talk about that.
I mean, it's a really interesting question. Personally, I really personally really like writing command line tools. I think in some ways there's no real, there's no real time limit to those if it's the right sort of utility for people. As for other software, it's interesting. It is a really interesting question. I haven't really thought about how long I expect things to last, other than I anticipate most web-based things. I just follow the sort of general rule of thumb there is most things that use the web in some way seem to have like a 3-year timeline. And then things on the back end of that might last longer. But yeah, given the choice, I'd probably be writing command line and then just maintaining those over a longer period.
I wouldn't mind jumping in. So I forgot to introduce this in my introduction, but I work in the open source side of scholarly publishing ecosystems. And my first experience in any kind of open source tool development came when we tried to estimate just how much money our authors at my university are spending to make their publications open access. So it involved a lot of the collection of non-machine readable data, cleaning it, making it machine readable. And as soon as we managed to run this tool for the first time, everything was immediately out of date. And I know that one of the big things that we're trying as a community to work towards is allowing for the open access, open source supported federated search of academic publications without needing to pay for access to such databases. And my biggest struggle in my work is the giants of scholarly publishers essentially either purchasing open source projects and bringing it into their privately maintained infrastructure, or like I mentioned, such just making it as hard as humanly possible for folks to work with their data. So I wanted to know if you or anyone else out there has any suggestions for struggling against the behemoth machine. I know part of this is the incentivization of open access and open source work in ways that we don't tend to see recognized as often. But I just want to know if anyone has any questions as to how we rage against the machine.
I guess I have some. I work with people here at the Smithsonian who run something called the Astrophysical Data System, and I've worked a lot with at least one of the main people there. But what we do is astronomical data has the advantage of having no monetary value in general. I had some great tapes from NASA that were labeled no monetary value from a space shuttle mission even. But and they are always working. Luckily in astronomy, a lot of the publishers are nonprofits, and we have issues with the big companies too. But we maintain a textual and at least image and text mixed database of all astronomical publications back to 1815 here, and it's combed around the world at several different places. So it's an interesting process. Most of the stuff that's published by the nonprofits becomes public after a year or so, and so it goes, and they maintain it now. So it works pretty well. It's tricky linking nature and science into this whole, or nature anyway, into this whole ecosystem. We have their abstracts always, but not necessarily the text unless you live but if you live somewhere where you can get it, the system links into the publisher's databases. So it's done pretty well. And the data that's in the papers, we think of data as the like stuff that makes the tables and the graphs up. We're still working on how to maintain that in a reliable way, but that's the kind of thing I work with. So we publish archives, and we have something called the Virtual Observatory, which is a group which for 20 years is spending a lot of time trying to make protocols to get to data from different places, easily just within our field. So it's doing it in a general way I can't even comprehend. We're lucky because we have some standard data formats that have been around for like 40 years. And my software that I distribute is based on that format. And so it's really very widely, I never know how widely used it is. I find out when people complain about bugs. And I fix them, or they fix them a bit. And so I did a presentation last fall on how to write shareable software, things I've learned over my career. I'll put a link in the chat to that.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind piping in on the earlier question. Like I'm the founder of Artifactual Systems, and I started the Access to Memory Atom and Archematica projects over 10 years ago. When I saw working as a consultant in the field of digital preservation and online access to archival collections, just saw like the dearth and the need for open source tools. Like I was very excited about the open source movement, and we saw this small, more niche market that was really underserved by that. So I, on a kind of a wing and a prayer, just started these projects. I got some small funding contracts to actually get these projects up and running, but then I had no clue on how to actually keep them up and running for, like, I was, at that point I was going to conferences trying to convince institutions to adopt the software and use it. But at the same time, I had no clue whether I was going to be able to maintain that software. I quickly realized I couldn't do it on my own, that I would need, more skilled developers on board to help do that, and just, more actual people involved in the whole process. And it was always like, I jealously looked at the US where there was Mellon grants, and there seemed to be like $1 million grants being handed out left and right for projects to start open source, and quite often for open source products. And there was no equivalent in Canada, like not being based in a university. Essentially I had a private consulting company, so I was considered a private entity. I didn't qualify for any of that money. At the same time, no investor was interested in investing in a company that gave away software for free to archives and libraries, right? Like a small niche market. Giving away free software was like it's still not considered a good investment strategy. And I essentially, evolved the support structure around the open source projects through the bounty program. Like it was just a matter of going from one contract to the next, convincing people that the software that we had, which wasn't CLI, like it was part of the whole goal was to make friendly user interfaces for archivists and librarians to use, to give them access to, digital preservation tools and bring them together in a single suite. The bounty program, I managed to convince one institution after the other that, you might want to adopt this software, and then, maybe you want to fund the next round of features for it. And it's that, that in and of itself is where how the company is established as where it is today. It's since then transitioned to, offering maintenance for, maintenance programs and contracts for the software, which is now part of its revenue stream. But I mean, quite frankly, I burned myself out doing that. Like I hit the wall. Like I was doing that for 2-3 years too long. Like I just couldn't keep up the charade. Like it was so much work trying to, keep contracts coming in, manage staff, worrying, staring at spreadsheets, worrying where the next few dollars were going to come from to keep the whole thing afloat. So I was very fortunate to be able to hire some good people, and I just said, I can't do this anymore. Like I've burnt out. I need to check out. And I passed the company off to some very talented people I had hired, and they kept the thing afloat and grew it. And now, I'm like living the founder's dream, where I'm able to come back and work as an employee, working as an analyst on those projects, and not having to worry about the management headaches, and other people are managing those issues. But Artifacts itself now has established itself as a major player in this field, and but now, sorry, this is a bit of a long rant, but I feel it's all very relevant, everything that's been said this morning so far, related to my own experience. But now we're running into the issue of, you know, the code base itself being, you know, 10 years old, and you know, it's holding us back from doing new cutting edge things. And it's, you know, we run into issues like, you know, losing backwards, like you know, moving from Python 2 to Python 3 is an example, like, having a really old unsupported object relational mapper in Atom. So things that are holding back the code base that we need to evolve, but now we're in a position where nobody's willing to privately fund the maintenance of software. It's like, well, these are core, we've got hundreds of institutions now running this software and relying on it. Some of them pay us as service providers. The majority don't. They're just benefiting from the free software, which is great. That's why we did it. We knew there wasn't lots of money in archives and libraries, and that's one of my main motivations, was to provide free software. But at the end of the day, we can't get funding for somebody to say, okay, here's some housekeeping money so you guys can bring this up to the next version. We still have to like find ways to get, you know, put money aside from contracts to do that work, and somehow now juggle contract work with being able to do that maintenance work. And it involves a lot of planning, like there's some major architecture analysis and decisions that have to be made, that we're now, I don't know if Jessica has run into similar things with her projects, but you know, that's a real challenge for maintaining free open source code, is when you start hitting that first generation and having to move to the next. So anyway, that's a bit of a rant, but that's my experience in the field.
Yeah, I'll just say the way I've been able to do this is sort of maybe weird, but I sort of think of myself as a tool maker. I don't like I do a lot of variety of things, but most of it is low level. And but I also work on projects that incorporate the tools. And I'm also at a location where there are lots of other people that use it. And so this all started when I learned how to use a system that I ended up not using for a big project, a space shuttle telescope. And then when the money ran out on that, they hired me because I knew all this stuff. And I had started writing a project, which this was in the late 80s, and I'm still maintaining this project. And people still use it. We wrote a paper in '98, and that paper is still cited quite a bit in astronomy. So in the meantime, I write data pipelines for newer and newer instruments. And some instruments that have been around a long time, I keep trying to streamline the pipeline because I run it. And it's been an interesting job. I'm on overhead. And so as long as there are lots of grants coming into the Center for Astrophysics where I work, I'm in pretty good shape. And so I have no kind of tenure, but I've been on the same job for 30 years now. So it's an interesting situation, and it used to be more common than it is now. And I'm afraid younger people won't find jobs like this because they don't really exist very much. And maybe they never have, but I've had several of them. This is my second pretty long-term job. The first one was only 8 years, but and so it's been an interesting situation. I'm really reluctant to apply my situation to anybody else, but are lessons and things that I've learned along the way. But what I write is pretty technical software. So one of the things I just wrote about in something is that I worry that because the software is so widely used, the technical information that's in it isn't known by people very much anymore. This has always been true with some of the software I wrote. We were at a conference in France, in Strasbourg, where you have to get there by a small plane. And there were all of us that knew how to use the World Coordinate System code, which is published, but still complicated to use. So the only people that understood it had to fly back to Paris on this small plane. So everybody was joking that if we were all on the same plane and it went down, nobody would be able to maintain the software anymore because nobody would understand what's going on at the lowest level. So it's always a problem with things that are technical, is spreading the knowledge around. It used to be in science that each new generation's, well, for like the 1950s to the 1990s anyway. Each new generation sort of wrote their own software, so they'd have to learn stuff and then write the software. And then just before the coming of the web, it changed, at least in my field, and software became widely shared. So most of the things that people do in astronomy, the software is open source, whereas in my previous job in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, you didn't really share your software because the software that did your science for you, you didn't really want other people doing exactly the same thing. Now, there's so much data that everybody doing the same thing is much more common. And it's sharing your software doesn't mean you don't get credit. And that's the other difference, is that if you work hard at it, you can get credit for the software in the literature. And so I've tried hard to do that. And I've been a proponent for publishing in scholarly publications what your software does if it does complicated things. Because then you get credit for it, which helps your career. I can tell the people that I work for that we need this, but all these other people are going to use it too, and that'll help the software do a better job for us. That's my argument. It's worked so far through 5 bosses, because I've stayed in the same place, but had the people above me have changed.
So we're just coming up to the end of our call now, but I want to close with one last thought. For those of us who aren't coders, what are the, I guess, not easiest, but lowest bar to entry ways that we as individuals or as institutions can support open source work?
Go on. My favorite pastime when I'm not writing code is reporting bugs and issues. And I think it's if there's a forum for any of your software that you're using to report these things, just put that information out there. First of all, it lets people know you're using the code, but second of all, it tells others that you might be struggling with the same thing as them. I think there's a lot of value to just reporting issues, and I think a lot of people tend to keep them under their hats.
Yeah, I do 2 things. I publish about my software, so there are references, and if people cite it, I like that. And I can tell people that I work for that, look, these people are using it, they're citing it. And the other thing is my email is on every subroutine that I wrote and every main program that I wrote. And so if people find bugs, they can write me. And all you have to do is read the code. And I distribute, I mean, since it's open source, it's been around long enough that it's had to run on different architectures. So it's usually compilable on a Linux system with just typing make, no matter what. You don't even have to do a configure. So, you know, that's what I like. I like to get feedback. I think feedback is the biggest thing. And then if you cite it, then the people you work for know you're using somebody else's software. And if any kind of support comes up, then that's a thing that they'll know too.
Thank you so much for sharing, everyone who's participated in the conversation today. I've been sitting here trying to chat in the chat and wrap up a call, but also look for a presentation that one of my colleagues is giving on software and code curation and preservation next week. I can't find it in time, but I will share the link with the list. Thank you, Ross, for being our special guest today and leading such a nuanced conversation and bringing questions back to the group. I will post the link to the Information Maintainers Google group in the chat right now. So for those of you who are on the maintainers list and also want to be on the Information Maintainers list, please sign up right there. And I'm really excited to keep the conversation going. So thanks so much to all of you for attending, especially the folks who are showing up for the first time. It's really great to meet all of you. And once again, I'm just so happy that all of you